and thank you very much for coming along to this. For those of you who weren't here earlier, I'm Paul Boyle, I'm the Vice-Chancellor at the university, and it's great to see you all here for what I think is going to be a hugely interesting talk. I did just walk in and I noticed all the brownies and other sugary sort of things, and I walked in eating one of those just a moment ago. Probably thought maybe I shouldn't have been doing that. We'll hear more about that, I'm sure. We're of course here for the inaugural lecture of Professor Richard Bracken, and he is going to talk to us about sugar and the critical importance of blood glucose. A really important topic, and one that not only is of interest, I'm sure, in sports and exercise science and in this faculty, but also across the institution and not least in our other faculty in medicine and allied health. Richard has a great CV. He's Vice Chair of the European Association for the Study of Diabetes, a very significant organisation, and is also chair of one of the subgroups of that. He co-leads on a range of different activities. I could read this list, but I won't go through all of them in the fullness of time. I did just want to say, though, how pleased I am that the faculty is running these inaugural lectures. Inaugural lectures are a really important part of what we do as a university, and it's great to have the opportunity to hear some of the ideas of our colleagues as they've progressed through their careers to this stage. So thanks a lot, Richard. We're really looking forward to this. No problem. I'll hand over to you and maybe say a few words at the end.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so I've got about 30 minutes to try and sort of cap about 15 years worth of ideas and funneling and rejections and successes along the way. And hopefully there's a bit of questions and answers time at the end. But for those of you that don't know me, I'm an exercise physiologist by trade and training. I've had a bit of a long-winded background to get to where I kind of am today. Originally starting off back on the Emerald Isle, in the University of Limerick, which had the first sports science course in Ireland, which started back in 1993, set up by an eminent vet, Craig Sharp, who you see over on the left-hand side. Sadly is no longer with us, but using his principles of physiology and his thirst for knowledge and understanding of the physiological responses to stress and exercise, he also had a passionate interest in exercise. And himself and Phil Jakeman, a couple of years later, have a very successful course that runs in Limerick now at the moment, and was a great pedigree in training, I think, from where I was initially coming out of the secondary level educational system into something that I thought was going to hold my interest for 4 years, the third year being spent in the Defence Forces. So it was a really, really fertile time to see what I didn't know. And as they usually say in undergraduate degrees, it's a mile long and an inch deep as to how much you can actually learn in a particular area. So that sort of sparked my interest, and I moved over into Manchester Metropolitan University, and you see some of the guys that were there at the time, Andy Jones, Derek Ball, Keith George, great guys in their area, still ploughing through research and their application of research into practice, and being one of the team that was helping Kipchoge to get sub 2 hours in the marathon. And so from there, I think it was another example of how you get into a more specific area. It takes longer, you still realize you don't know so much, so you think about then moving on into doing a PhD. And then I managed to convince people in Coventry to give me a degree in exercise physiology, specializing in the sympathoadrenal responses to exercise. And unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but my supervisor at the time, Steve Brooks, was just a great mind. He came from the Loughborough stock of exercise metabolism with, lots of great papers coming out about Wingate and human metabolism and so forth. Rob James and Val Cox as well. So great training, I think, in pedigree. And then you're kicked out. Then you have to go and find a job and try and get going with your own ideas and your own research. And thankfully, in 2005, I got taken on by Swansea University in sports science to then start into this and where I am at the moment. So the first thing you do is you go and look about who's in the offices, halls, and other departments that's around you. And at the time, there was a really creative environment about collaboration and an understanding of, really forming groups that were passionate about research. And the Diabetes Research Unit formed in about 2008, 2009, with some great guys in the area. And these were all very specifically into an interest in diabetes, in the multitude of areas that you can tap into diabetes. Formed by Steve Bain, and Steve Luzio is the operational manager, Gareth Dunseat, the laboratory manager, as you see here, and a range of other individuals interested in everything from genetics, pediatrics, obesity, cardiovascular disease, really cutting edge stuff that they were interested in exploring. And unfortunately, you know, Myreg Williams down on the bottom left-hand side, no longer with us, but a passionate driver as well on collaborative research across the Lucker Bridge, really pushing on this Welsh fortitude of resources that you have to push on research. So this is where I have been doing a lot of our research over the last number of years. Several postgrads in the audience will testify how well they've tread a path up and down these halls with blood samples with patients. It's in the ILS2 building. It's a clinical research facility, and it's a great opportunity to really, under controlled circumstances, you know, look for answers to questions that are very hard to find in real life, in the observational setting. So we do a lot of our research in here. It's very driven around the potential for understanding glucose management. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means and the number of factors that interplay with that. But I think it's vitally important that we do have facilities like this as a function of getting to the wider period of understanding of the breadth of research in this as an area. So I hope the talk lured you in a little bit anyway. What's he talking about, 4 grams of glucose or sugar? And I think the start point on that is that that's really all that's circulating in the bloodstream. It's a very small amount of glucose, and it's a very sensitive trigger to changes that happen in the body, you know, as a dysfunction, and potentially chronically to the development of conditions that might result in, for example, diabetes. But, you know, it's one of the sources of carbohydrates in the body. We eat carbohydrates every day, and we take it in as part of our diet. There's a large sump within the muscle. It's probably our largest sump of carbohydrates we can call upon for stressful activities like exercise. Second largest sump is that of the liver, which is a call-upon sump to release foods and carbohydrates when the sensitivity of the bloodstream is starting to wane a little bit. So if you put them all together, the total carbohydrate pool is very susceptible to change on a daily basis. And if you add in things like exercise or feeding, it's even more susceptible to change. And therefore, there's no such thing as a stable blood glucose per se. It's always fluctuating up and down. And I want to show you some slides and some information that we've been doing that makes us understand better how there's always a constant regulation taking place. And if there's not, then there are potential for problems. What you'll see over here is, on the top slide, liver glycogen concentration, the liver carbohydrate store. And normally you'll see the red line here in different individuals as being quite wide-ranging but healthy. There's quite a range, but it's easy to deplete them. And even in the space of 24 hours, for example, or an overnight fast, you can pretty much reduce significantly your store of liver carbohydrate. The good news is, if you then go and have a large carbohydrate meal, you can not only replace it, but you can also supercompensate it under the right conditions as well. Similarly, with muscle, the red indicates on the bottom graph the muscle glycogen concentrations in a normal group of individuals, and then following a low carbohydrate diet with exercise can show that you can almost deplete these concentrations as well. Again, thankfully, if you engage in the right practice of high carbohydrate feeding, you can supercompensate these carbohydrate stores, and so they offer an opportunity or an insight into seeing how stressful things like feeding or exercise can have on some of the bodily functions. Now this is a complicated slide, but just to show you one small thing. In the non-diabetic individual, in the liver and in skeletal muscle, there is quite a stress with exercise that can readily reduce glycogen concentrations. And so if you see in the yellow here that after an overnight fast, there is a reasonably healthy store of glycogen, but after 1, 2, 3, or 4 consecutive hours of exercise, you're likely to nearly exhaust those stores. Similarly, in the other side of the graph, muscle glycogen stores after 1, 2, 3, and 4 hours of exercise can significantly reduce as well. So I'm not really interested in either of those as much as what's going on in the middle. This is your 4 grams of carbohydrate circulating in the bloodstream. And you can see here from 0 to 2, 3, and it's only when you get to about 4 hours of consecutive exercise that you see that glucose concentrations are significantly starting to reduce. So we have a resilience in our system. That means we can hold on to a stable blood glucose concentration. Why is that important? Well, if you notice up here, the brain doesn't really have a store of carbohydrate. It's negligible. So it needs a constant supply of carbohydrate to function properly. And when it doesn't get that, then there are problems. So this is I'm not sure if any of you have seen these devices that are more prevalent than ever before. They're called interstitial glucose monitors. And you'll see them on the backs of people's arms. Most people with diabetes are now being prescribed them, which is great news, because they give you on a real-time basis surrogate blood glucose concentrations each day, every 5 minutes, day on day on day. So you have the ability now to track your glucose concentrations, see its rises, see its falls, and then hopefully start to manage your blood glucose concentrations better than when you were taking blood stick measurements from the tops of your fingers. This is a trace of a person who does not have diabetes. So they're well managed, and they understand that they have a system that's in play that can readily alter and regulate the normal blood glucose concentrations within certain ranges. And that generally happens because of this organ here, the pancreas. Because when it senses high blood sugar, the pancreas can then secrete insulin to pull glucose into tissues, like the liver, or into other cells around the body. Vitally important for getting rid of what's called hyperglycemia, which we get when we eat some food, and which you can see here in this person who was probably eating a meal. Conversely, what stops the glucose levels from bottoming out in the bloodstream? Well, then when it goes very low, the signal of low blood sugar is received by the pancreas, which then secretes another hormone called glucagon to then release glucose from the stored tissues like the liver. So we have an ability to regulate, within normal reason, a tight enough control of blood glucose concentration. If things get a little bit deranged and both of those hormones don't work so well, you can call upon another couple of organs in the body, the hypothalamus in the brain to release growth hormone, and several stress hormones located in the kidneys: cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. These hormones come up as a last resort to rescue people from hypoglycemia and are very effective at bringing glucose levels back up when the pancreas wasn't doing so well. So the pancreas is a very important organ, and unfortunately, there's very many people that don't have a functioning pancreas that's appropriate for the needs of good blood glucose management. People with type 1 diabetes, of which there are now over 8 million people globally, have a dysfunctional pancreas brought about by an early exposure to a virus or other condition that's turned off their functioning beta cells to release insulin. This puts them in the need for exogenous insulin injections for the rest of their life. And at the present time, whether it's a pump or a pen, that's the medication that they have to take. People with type 2 diabetes tend to develop the condition when their beta cells become unresponsive to the needs of the glucose in the circulation. They don't respond so well. They either under or over secrete insulin into the circulation, and then the body correspondingly turns down their sensitivity to insulin and builds up resistance, and therefore blood glucose levels just build up. And this hyperglycemia that you'll see readily in people with diabetes is a cause for many of the complications of diabetes: nerve damage, kidney damage, blindness, obesity, weight gain, and cardiovascular disease. So we have a real issue about this organ in our body, making it work well, and understanding if it's not working well, what can we do about it? And I think in the sense of global awareness of diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, we are staggered every time the International Diabetes Federation carry out a survey of the latest statistics. Because not only do they give you an understanding of where we are at the moment, they try to project forward for the next 25 years. And every time they do this exercise, every 5 to 8 years, the numbers are outweighing or increasing faster than their predictions would have existed on the previous round. We are now at a situation where by 2045, over 700 million people globally are likely to have diabetes, with many millions more not aware that they have the condition. This is extremely worrying in places like the Middle East and North Africa, or indeed in Africa, where their desire to acquire westernized habits, adopt westernized sedentary lifestyles, is causing the greatest rate of gain of diabetes globally. So we believe that this is a global challenge, and it starts with obviously understanding the regulation or control of one's glucose. So I showed you the orange line earlier on of a person without diabetes. This is a line of a person with type 1 diabetes. You can see that the undulations are much greater than the person that has good glucose regulation. And we tend to define what the standard of good regulation is by what's considered to be euglycemic levels, a normal range. As we said, we can't state a specific number, but it's a range that's acceptable, it's healthy, and it doesn't cause any long-standing ill effects. But when you start to profile a person with diabetes to these conditions that a person without diabetes has, you find that there's a lot more time spent in the hypoglycemic and hyperglycemic zones, where the person that doesn't have diabetes doesn't. So these are real issues. Lots of time with lots of sugar in the bloodstream is not healthy, and periods of time where blood sugars dip very low is equally not healthy. You may not see this so well from where you're sitting, but there are acute and chronic issues with this cycle of undulation that's very wide. For example, with hyperglycemia, there'll be a need to void all of this excess sugar. So people may urinate more frequently. They may have a loss of energy, very lethargic. They may have blurred vision. They may experience weight loss. And these are all telltale signs that the charities know that they can prescribe to people to think, does my child or does my relation or may I have the symptoms of diabetes? Similarly, on an acute level, the issues around low blood sugar levels are equally fundamentally important. Maybe more so, because some of the issues about lack of circulating glucose to the brain can cause cognitive issues that prevent good decision making, slurred speech, and then the autonomic symptoms that go with that in terms of elevated heart rate, blood pressure changes taking place as well. That can lead to what's called syncope or fainting. In uncontrolled or isolated circumstances, individuals have fainted and fallen into coma, and unfortunately, in some cases, people have passed away through seizure because of a lack of available carbohydrate in their bloodstream, powering cognitive decision-making that might allow them to get help. Between 4 and 10% of the deaths of people with type 1 diabetes is due to low blood sugar. So this is a real issue in people with type 1 diabetes specifically, because they don't have the rescue like we do who don't have diabetes. So we're now just over 100 years since they discovered the hormone insulin isolated, extracted it, and now it's being manufactured globally by several companies around the world as a way of regulating high blood sugar levels and tempering blood glucose levels into a range. And next year is the 100 years of the Nobel Prize in Medicine that was awarded to Best, Banting, Collip and MacLeod for their discoveries in Toronto on insulin. So I think we live in a very fertile area since then, and our cross-disciplinary research in Swansea, even in the few years that I've been here, has been targeted at blood glucose management from a range of different angles. We have food companies who are very interested in low glycemic or low sugar alternatives. We have medical or technical companies who produce devices or insulins, interested in the management of blood glucose. We have NHS, Welsh Government, bariatric clinics, the charities in the UK, JDRF and Diabetes UK, who are all very interested in the preservation and quality of life of people who are diabetic. And we are engaged in lots of charitable organizations or scientific organizations that put up diabetes research at the forefront as being very important. Maybe not always for cure, but certainly for treatment and definitely for care. So I think we're very fortunate in Swansea with the legacy of the work in the Diabetes Research Unit and the opportunities for promotion of lifestyle that has allowed us to be able to gain a foothold in better understanding what different elements of lifestyle actually do in diabetes management and how can we optimize those. And the primary factors that we tend to focus on in our research involve glucose monitoring, nutritional management, exercise strategies, and the interaction of medications with these factors. So it's a big circle. And if you twist one button, you come out with one response. If you twist another button, you come up with another response. So it takes us quite a while to get answers to that, especially when we know, as a healthy supply of physiologists in the audience, that exercise is variable. You go and do one exercise, you have a response. You go back and do the same exercise the next day, you've got a slightly different response. So it's quite a variable beast. If you change the type of exercise, you change the outcomes, whether it's strength training or endurance. And there's lots of inputs to managing blood glucose levels. Imagine if you also have to take insulin on top of this, either by a pump or by injection, because you don't have a fully functioning pancreas. And so that's the nature, I think, of the problem that we're looking at all the time. How do we create a confidence by stabilizing one element and then studying another on an outcome that can go forward for a better understanding of blood glucose management? And this is what we do. And I'm incredibly thankful to my PhD and postdoc students on the right-hand side because they've been doing this type of work from probably 2010, where we've been harnessing expertise, bringing them into the laboratories, recruiting patients with the condition, and then controlling a certain number of variables and observing what the outcome is downstream from that. And here you see a patient who's been very forthcoming with his time and blood to give us an understanding that the stress of exercise causes a change in glucose. But if we're looking at the impact of, example, an amount of carbohydrate or an insulin, what is the betterment of that glycemic response compared to what was previously hitherto known? So we do lots of these types of experiments. They're expensive, they're necessary, but I think from our point of view, they end up creating this. This is probably a very synopsized snapshot of about 12 to 15 years worth of research papers that's gone into an understanding of what people should do when they want to exercise safely without disrupting carbohydrates or blood glucose in or after physical activity. This is a very much synopsized version of what we have produced, but we have sent a lot of our findings out in there through publications, and they have been adopted by consensus positions, scientific statements from different organizations globally, whether it's in Canada, the US, or more in the British realm. And we believe that this is the way to go forward, to create a research evidence base that allows you to be able to say with some confidence that when you do the following, you'll have a stable or safer blood glucose level in a way that's prescribable then to patients to advocate doing more physical activity. So that is also why a lot of our findings have gone on to be adopted into healthcare educational programs. And particularly with some of the leading charities globally, JDRF Peak, there's been a real push on getting these types of resources to the patients directly and the healthcare providers to motivate them to prescribe exercise more safely by just having a few prudent guidelines that people can adopt to avoid hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia. We're currently working with the EASD, and we'll be producing our own European version of these guidelines very shortly. But I think they're fundamental, and they're the link that you need to get from laboratory studies to consensus papers to back to the people who actually it matters most to. It's not all about just creating guidelines for exercise. We do find novel insights into some of our research, and this is a rather busy slide, but I'm going to synopsize it really tightly for you. That sometimes some of the signals that you see at rest aren't always there during exercise. And this particular study allowed us to explore that we thought if you're exercising during a very low carbohydrate or blood glucose situation, that you were going to find the same adrenaline surge that you might see at rest in a person who's having a hypo. We didn't find that. And our catecholamine concentrations were identical, yet when we looked at the level of the metabolome, really complex protocols that looked very specifically at different fragments of fuels in the breakdown during exercise under a normal or a low glucose scenario, we found an energy crisis taking place in the bloodstream at that point. And that was a lack of available fuel that was definable in some of the metabolites that we studied. And this provides for us another avenue that we're currently going down in, is maybe the scenarios and protocols that we work out for protection of glucose at rest might not always be survivable in the context of exercise. So we need to see what the signals are for going forward on that are likely to be. I'm going to switch tack a little bit and bring you back to where I was talking about the potential for real-time glucose monitoring from the back of a sensor, the back of the arm with a sensor. And most people think it's a blood glucose measurement, but in fact it's the compartment here, the interstitial fluid, which is the filament of most of these sensors resides. So it's not the same as blood. It's a surrogate marker of blood glucose level. And there are many companies, some of which we've tested the devices or used them readily in our clinical trials, that have a variation on that. Nowadays, the apps are so good, they're off your phone, so you can see the information relatively quickly. Some other devices are set under the skin and are actually implanted there for up to 6 months at a time. And the latest research that's starting to come out from some of our colleagues from the DRU is actually involving a radio frequency device that's also able to measure blood glucose without having to impale anything into the skin or interstitial fluid. So we really are pushing the agenda, I think, in the context of glucose sensing technology. But the question is, well, what way does that respond in exercise with all of the fluids moving around the body, states of dehydration or hyperhydration developing? And we're still at the cusp, really, of trying to understand that. What we do know is we've produced a position statement for the EASD and the American Diabetes Association on how to more safely exercise if you have diabetes with these devices so that you don't experience hypoglycemia. And that's, I think, a first state of affairs for at least saying, here's practical things that we can do that can then encourage people to be more physically active. We're now also pushing into another area of interest, and you'll see that here is a small sensor on the skin, and it's transmitting a glucose value to the phone. but it's also transmitting a signal to this insulin pump. And based upon the glucose measurement, the insulin pump decides to either increase its basal rate or reduce it. And this is what's called a hybrid closed-loop glucose delivery system, or insulin delivery system. And we've got a postdoc, Olivia McCarthy, who's working with Kirsten Norgard and Sina Smith and Kasper Christensen in Steno Center in Denmark at the moment, trying to get an understanding of, well, what's happening in exercise when glucose shifts are very quick, and can the pump cope with this quick speed of transition of glucose changes to send appropriate amounts of insulin into the body? Because if it sends too much insulin in, you could experience what's called iatrogenic diabetes or hypoglycemia, a very quick lowering of glucose due to too much insulin delivery. So this is exciting work that I think is coming out in the next year or so, and should put us into a real strong position to understand how technology like pumps are vital for diabetes care, but also only if they're suitable for encouraging exercise. Our work has also encompassed out of the laboratories into more observational settings, the inclusion of work involving high-end athletes. And we've been fortunate enough, I think, to be able to look at the best athletes in the world, all of whom have type 1 diabetes. So the Team Novo Nordisk is a collection of 17 riders whose mission statement is to inspire, to educate, and empower everyone with diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2, to become more physically active and adopt a positive lifestyle. And they travel the world racing in professional standard events, and we had an opportunity to connect with the team and start to liberate some of the data streams that are being collected in the field. And there's a lot of information. You know, we've got very high-end athletes who are passionate about collecting their power measurements, heart rates, and also a bit clandestine about their nutrient and fluid intake for obvious reasons. But they're also type 1 diabetic. So they have to monitor their glucose level. Most of them are on CGM sensing on a real-time basis. So they're constantly managing their glucose, and they're constantly taking insulin. So we put all of this together in a big data exercise to try to better understand what exactly makes these guys survive doing 5-hour rides on a day-by-day basis in a way that allows them to compete. And we produced some great papers. I think it's been a real push on ourselves during COVID to try and get the most out of that information when the camps were completed. And some really new novel insights into, even though they experience quite a large amount of time in euglycemia, they're not immune to hypoglycemia, and they can still experience this. But what if they're not diabetic? What if they're actually in the pursuit of excellence? Is biohacking the new frontier for exploring, new areas of investigation that might allow them to optimize exercise performance? And we had the opportunity, Ross, a PhD student who's in the audience, had the opportunity to connect with Kenyan elite female cyclists and profile their glucose sensing over a 10-day camp. And here you see just a token of the data that's coming out of it. Initially we thought, this is going to be obvious. They're not diabetic. They're not going to experience hypoglycemia. What we found was actually quite interesting. There is a percentage of time that these riders are actually experiencing hypoglycemia. So if we go back to the symptoms of hypoglycemia that we talked about at the start, are we then suggesting that there might be a potential for these athletes to incur the wrath of low blood sugar and its stress response in a way that might potentially impact on their next day performance? And that's something we're currently looking at. We're also playing catch up at the moment. I don't know if any of you have seen the Berlin Marathon over the weekend, but Kipchoge won in a new official time of 2 hours and 1 minute and 9 seconds. But he is also wearing a CGM device, and he is also getting data on his glucose state throughout the 2 hours. So either we don't know everything they know, or we're still trying to find out what it is through our data, what they may need to know about the potential for glucose monitoring and management in non-diabetic but athletic populations. So that's why we're pushing for a study that we're about to start, I think, in the next week or two in ultra-endurance athletes, where we will be profiling riders and runners in a way that allows us chronically over months to start to see what the impact of hypoglycemia might be on performance. Stay tuned. Okay, so I'm coming away from the athletic spheres. The type of work that we're interested in doing is not just at the high-end level. We have a pedigree, really, of looking at problems that might involve glucose dysregulation. And in our way of looking at the inputs into how to better optimize the potential situation, we managed to create or were part of a research team of Project Sirgar many years ago. Project Sirgar was a great initiative where we were looking to profile the cardiovascular disease risk and diabetes risk of the workforce, predominantly males, led by some great guys like Rhys Williams, Jeff Stevens, and we had a PhD student, Ben Gray, who was a paper machine. He interrogated data like I've never seen. And from our point of view, the big things that came out of that were, you need to be able to understand that some people are hard to reach. They don't want or can't go to GPs, so we need to uncover these potential people in the population, because when you do, they have a high degree of risk of acquiring diabetes or cardiovascular disease in their lifetime. And we related the degrees of fitness and aerobic state of capacity to some of these markers to encourage occupational health, to start to encourage physical activity in the breaks or during their working week in a way that they probably wouldn't have experienced if they were to go to their GP. Some of those principles we're now implementing with the Ospreys and their charitable arm, Ospreys in the Community. And we're now fortunate enough to have collected baseline data and had future funding from the Ospreys in the community to allow us to start to see what the impact of risk when people stop playing rugby in their 20s and 30s is likely to be, and then begin a potential intervention to see if we can ameliorate that risk as they begin their regular exposure to a social entity like walking rugby. So stay tuned for that one. And I'm running out of time, but I want to go completely the other way and not look at exercise and look at nutrition. And I'm not quite sure how this happened, but I seem to be standing in a field in County Carlow talking about oats as a physiologist, and people seem to be listening to me. So if I can back up a little bit, there is a project that I am now involved in as a lead for Swansea, an interreg project that involves investigating the potential health benefits of oats. And initially I thought this is way off my comfort zone, and to some extent it probably still is, until we apply the principles of understanding metabolic testing in certain cohorts at risk of developing diabetes. And oats are a funny crop. Generally, they're a smaller produced crop in terms of global yield, because you'll see that they're not as densely packed with seeds as, for example, wheat or corn. But the rate of growth of the need for more stock or more fuel globally has increased, so more people need to grow oats. And oats are generically thought of as being healthy, and typically that boils down to one particular element of oats, and that's beta-glucan. And beta-glucan is variable in different varieties of oats, and it can be cultivated or harnessed through genetic manipulation. And we've teamed up with the guys in Aberystwyth who have specific resources up there to allow them to do that season after season after season. So from our point of view, here's just a snapshot of what you do when you turn up the amount of beta-glucan in the same bowl of oats, nothing else being different. Here you see the lower amount of beta-glucan in the blue line, reaching a peak in blood glucose concentration after about 30 minutes, and then a fall over the next 90 minutes. And the high beta-glucan concentration oat is demonstrating a lower glycemic response. And if we talk about this idea of tightening up the euglycemic band in the population, this simple change in this particular product is inducing less of a glycemic response and a more euglycemic approach over the ingestion period. So we are working avidly to get projects up and running with different varieties of oats, different oat-containing products, and exploring this interplay between nutrition and glycemic health on this particular project. And then finally, I think what's next from our point of view, we are moving forward on the university agenda of making better research more interdisciplinary. And myself and Professor Tariq Butt are leading on an interdisciplinary research institute that's dealing with health, technology, and potential solutions in a way that's going to hopefully start to connect either better people in faculty or across faculty on these big questions. So I think that that's something that I think I'm looking forward to over the next couple of years in a way that I think is going to shed new light on what Swansea does well and can do better. Okay, I need to finish off. And I just want to say thank you to some of my valued global colleagues, which along the way I think has been incredibly insightful, either at the UK or European or global level, because they always bring new ideas and challenge the dogma that I think I've thought I knew when I approach a particular project. When I was putting this slide together, I realized there was a heavy weightedness to the European colleagues, which post-Brexit I think tells us a lot about how challenging it is likely to be going forward with maintaining links for being part of research. But nonetheless, I think we do have a role to play, and it is global, as parties to advancing the agenda for better glycemic management. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, I think having strong postgraduate and postdoctoral students is the secret to success in being an academic. And again, I think the word support there is more for me, not for me to offer support to the postgrads and postdocs, because I think they are fundamentally the guys that turn up on the day, smiles on their faces, deal with the problems, all of the booking issues, all of the issues around recruitment, all of the data analysis, the turnover. They are the cogs in the machine that we'd be lost without. So, you know, I'm so fortunate. And I think, again, when I was putting this slide together, I realized one thing. My eyes seem so tired in nearly every single one of these photographs, but I'm smiling. So I think from my point of view, there must be something going right in at least partially some of these slides. But they're great. I valued every moment I interact with students, and I long hope that that will continue. And then my final slide is that of family. And I think I'd be lost if I didn't say thank you to my guys, the Team Wirish. So as you know, I'm originally hailing from Ireland, and Hayley is from Swansea. And I think, you know, when you go home at night, they really don't want to hear about it. So you've got to move on. You've got to keep on pushing to include the family and listen to them too. And that includes the dog, who I think is obviously one of the more important members of the family too. Okay, so I'm going to synopsize my advice to people who I think, you know, want to get into this as an area or value the kind of area of academia that might be of interest to them. One, I think, is keep pushing. It's not easy out there anymore to do anything in terms of getting money to do research, doing the research, and then continuing the research to make a difference. This is me last Sunday at the Swansea Bay 10K. I'm not fast anymore, but at least I did it. And I think from my point of view, you've got to keep pushing yourself to be able to say that you still can. And the final piece of advice is, yes, you can work hard, but I think you've got to play hard as well. And so from my point of view, if there's no breaks, it's not worth doing. So you've got to balance it off. So thank you for your time. It's a whistle-stop tour of blood glucose management. I think it's quite important. It is fertile going forward for the next number of years. And yeah, take any questions.
Thank you, Richard. I think covering so many important topics, very interesting. So we actually run out of time, but I think still we can take a couple of questions and then we can continue the discussion. Biagio.
Hi, very nice talk. Thank you very much. I mean, very, very informative. I wanted to ask, is continuous glucose monitoring changing the way in which we define diabetes, and is it somewhat influencing or disrupting the field in prevention and in this global challenging?
Yes. So now clinicians base some of their definitions about what is diabetes on the basis of the data that comes out of CGM sensing. So before it was a finger prick sample of blood every 6 months that gave a long-term marker of blood glucose. Now we're looking at the cycles of glucose up and down in a 3-week period. And the data is strong enough within that to cause worry signals to say this could be diabetes. So very much on that front. In terms of prevention, yes, there is a strong observational trials in many thousands of people now that when you put a person on a CGM device, they will start to improve their blood glucose concentration. If they combine that with better lifestyle habits like nutrition or physical activity, they can reverse some types of diabetes, pre to normal or type 2 to pre-diabetes. So I think we do have strength in these devices for changing the nature, bending the curve, as they say.
Okay, thank you.
So how important is it for otherwise healthy people to manage their blood glucose? And do you envisage a time, if the technology allows, like health smartwatches incorporate a glucose monitor, and would that be beneficial?
The time is now. There's several companies that are working on radio frequency based sensing of blood glucose that can be easily incorporated. Some of them have a silicone patch that sits underneath the watch that can then transmit to the watch and be adopted in the display for glucose concentrations. So the question, I think, is prevention of diabetes. And if people are worried, they have the option to tap into this as a signal to start to see what the impact of eating might be, or if they're feeling grotty, is it because they're feeling low? So if you have the information that's real time and flowing, you then have the ability to start to think, maybe this isn't right, maybe I should get it checked out by the clinical or healthcare professionals. So I think we are at a stage where it's becoming better that you don't have to have regular blood sampling to start to get this information, because it's too hit and miss. You might miss the curve, as it were. And I do think from our point of view, when you provide the information to the normal population and start to see, there will be a percentage of people who weren't aware that they had dysregulated glucose metabolism, in which case you're stopping those developing into the diabetic population.
I think we have to stop there. Thanks, Richard. So before I ask the Vice Chancellors to present a small token of our appreciation, I would really like to thank Richard, not only for the speech, also stepping into the leadership position and also providing our impact case studies. Right? So fantastic work, Richard. I really appreciate your work to the faculty and the university. Second, I would really like to thank Professor Paul Boyle for taking time to come today to introduce the speakers, and finally, family, Richard's family and audience. Now, I would really like to
invite Paul to present a Welsh crystal engraved with your name
Oh,
in
okay.
order to remember the day and to treasure it.
Great, well,
Oh, very good.
something for the mantelpiece, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Should we take it over there?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was excellent.
Thank you very much.
indeed.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Not
Thank
at all.
you. I know you have to
I've got to
leave.
run,
Yeah,
I'm afraid.
thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks a million, Rasu. That's great.
We still have time, tea, lots of food outside, so we can still continue our discussion outside. Thank you very much again for supporting Richard today.
Thank you, Rasu.